So thank you all so much for being here tonight. It is so nice to see this room full of people that I know. There's some new faces, and we are just so excited to share all about Washington County history and also Walt Disney history. There is a Minnesota tie, though, so don't be worried about it. Like as Brent said, my name is Emily Kishler Krawczewski. I am so thrilled that my parents are here from Ohio. So round of applause for them. And for my husband, who orchestrated all of it and kept it a secret from me until Wednesday night. So really appreciate that. So let's jump into it. So Walt Disney has been something that I've been interested in for such a long time. I took this photo last time I was at Walt Disney World, and that is his signature there. So we're going to learn how he created a magic kingdom. As of September 2nd, 2025, the Walt Disney Company was worth $212 billion. This part is designed to go fast, so hang on. The Walt Disney Company has 6 worldwide theme parks, including Disneyland, Walt Disney World, Tokyo Disney Resort, Disneyland Paris, Shanghai Disney Resort, and Hong Kong Disneyland Resort. The Walt Disney Company owns Walt Disney Studios Live Action, Disney Pixar, the Disney Store, Lucasfilm, Disney Cruise Line, Marvel, the Disney Channel, Disney on Ice, 20th Century Fox, National Geographic, ESPN, not to mention all of their Broadway plays, not to mention all of these companies that are amidst the ones that I just mentioned. And it was all started by our guy, Mr. Walt Disney. He's the man of the hour. This is the same man who was in front of hundreds of thousands of people on TV, but the same man who used to live in his office and eat cold beans out of a can. What fascinates me about Walt Disney? The fact that he believed in himself and his vision so much that he was willing to put everything in his life on the line, literally his life insurance at one point, to make this dream come true for himself and everybody around him. That he worked relentlessly with such determination to create something exactly as he had envisioned. The fact that he wanted to create a world where good people always come out on top, justice is always served, and hard work makes anything possible. And even if that's not a reflection of real life, it's not supposed to be. It's an escape, temporary one, where you can be happy and free and away from the stresses and cares of everyday life just for a little while. We can all use a little bit of that, and Walt Disney certainly could too. Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago in 1901. He joined 3 older brothers, Herbert, Raymond, and Roy O., and later a little sister named Ruth. The Disney family lived in a house, you'll see it up there, that Walt's father Elias actually built on Tripp Avenue, where he was working as a contractor. Walt was born in the upstairs bedroom. Roy O. stepped into the role of doting older brother, pushing little Walt in his pram up and down the street in their neighborhood. This dynamic between these 2 boys was something that we will see play out throughout all of their lives, and we'll talk about more as we get into our story here. First, let's meet the parents, though. Walt's mother, Flora, was born on New Year's Day in 1888. She is an Ohioan, which means that she was perfect. Win a football game sometime, Minnesota. She met Elias Disney as a young woman and was literally the girl next door, owning family farms right next to each other in Kismet, Florida. She was a kind woman. She had a great sense of humor, and Walt really enjoyed making her laugh. She also served as the family peacemaker. This is a story that I want to tell that I think really encompasses her personality. The Disneys didn't have a lot of money when Walt was growing up, and knowing that her husband Elias would frown upon her using anything that they could sell for a profit, Flora would fix toast for breakfast and serve it to her kids upside down. That way Elias would not see the butter that she had spread underneath for her kids. Sweet. Elias Charles Disney was born in what is now Ontario, Canada. Typical of fathers in this early Victorian area, he was basically no fun at all. While Walt got his sense of play from his mother and joyfulness and practical joking, Walt got so many things from his father, and so many of those things were basically doing the exact opposite of what Elias would do. Elias was strict, he was dour, he was really religious, he walked a very straight and narrow path. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he rationed his words, and it really didn't show many emotions except for anger. Elias's anger was likely rooted in the fact that he wasn't a very successful man, but not for lack of trying. After he and Flora were married, he bought an orange grove in Florida, and then everything froze and he lost the whole crop. He worked as a carpenter for a while in Chicago, and that was okay, but he really didn't make a lot of money doing it. He worked really hard, but oftentimes he was met with failure. Nevertheless, Walt's relentless, hardworking nature, his attention to detail, and even political views came from him, and that's something we'll continue to see come up in our story today. After Ruth was born, 2 years after Walt, Elias and Flora noticed that their neighborhood in Chicago, and just the city in general, was getting more dangerous. When two neighborhood boys around Herb and Ray's ages were arrested for killing a policeman, Elias made up his mind, we're getting the family out of here. Elias's brother, Robert, had some farmland in this little town called Marceline, Missouri, and Elias decided, that sounds pretty good, let's give that a try. Packed up the family, and they went down to Missouri. And even though it definitely did not seem like it at the time, I'm sure, this was probably the most important decision anyone ever made in Walt Disney's life. Walt's wife, Lillian Disney, said that Marceline was probably the most important part of Walt's life. This photo here is a recreated barn that resembles the Disney's barn that they had on their property when they were in Marceline. When the Disneys rolled into town in 1906, Marceline was small and quaint. It had a cute little downtown and lots of farms. Altogether, about 4,500 residents were there. Elias jumped into farming, and he relied really heavily on those three older boys to prepare the land for crops and get it ready for the harvest. Walt was only 5. You know how 5-year-olds are. He was no help around the farm. He was too little. But the farm became his playground, and he played in the creek. He waved to neighbors as they were riding by on their buggies, and took walks in the woods and found blackberries and raspberries and played with all of the animals on the farm. Elias had purchased cows, pigs, chickens, and I guess pigeons, I don't know how that works, to help out on the farm and be a source of revenue, and they all became Walt's playmates. He even learned, you'll love this, how to ride on the back of one of their pigs and ride it around the farmland. The neighbors would come over and he would do this party trick for everybody in the neighborhood. Flora took up the role of farm wife, tending to the vegetable garden, cooking up big meals, mending clothes, churning butter to sell in town. And it was said that Flora's butter was so pure and sweet that the grocery man gave it special position on his counter. They also had family nearby, including aforementioned Uncle Robert, and his wife, Margaret. And Margaret was actually the first person to give Walt a drawing pad and a set of crayons and really encouraged him in his art, even though he was only, a little kid. Another relative was Uncle Mike, but he came and went very, very fast. There was a train track next to the Disney's farm, and he was an engineer. So he would take the engine right by the Disney's farm, and Walt would run out and wave to him sometimes. That also became a really big love of his life, was trains. Walt also became obsessed with drawing. He took that pad from his Aunt Margaret and just colored all over the place. One of my favorite stories is that their neighbor, who was a retired doctor named Doc Sherwood, commissions this little kid, Walt, to draw a picture of his beloved horse, Rupert. Walt later recalled, the result was pretty terrible. But both the doctor and his wife praised the drawing highly, to my great delight. This is the farmhouse that the Disney family lived in Marceline, and it's still standing today, but the siding when the Disneys lived there was white, not red. That's important to know for our next story. When Elias and Flora went into town one day, Walt and Ruth were left at home. In this era, it was normal to just leave your little kids at home and hope they didn't chop their arms off in the farm equipment. Walt and Ruth began poking around, seeing what mischief they could get into, and they spied this can of black paint. And they thought this would be fun. So they pried open the paint can, they got sticks from the yard, and they started drawing on the side of the house. Ruth drew some zigzags, and Walt drew some houses with chimneys, and there was smoke coming out, and they just had the best time until they tried to get that paint off. They started scrubbing it, and it would not budge. So they start to get nervous. Eventually, they realized that that can of paint was no paint at all, but black tar. Oh, shoot. Ruth is quoted later as saying, "My father was so angry, he just left it there. It was still on the side of the house when we moved." Although Walt and Ruth were having the time of their lives on this farm, not everyone in the Disney family was having such a good time. Elias, simply put, was just bad at farming. For a while, he refused to use fertilizers, saying that it was like giving whiskey to a man. He felt better for a little while, but then he was worse off than before. Sounds sciencey, doesn't it? Walt's older brothers, Herb and Ray, they were at the end of their rope. They needed to go. When Elias heard that they were going to spend their extra earnings on gold pocket watches with fancy little chains attached, Elias just lost his mind. He said, "This is frivolous, this is indulgent. I'm going to take the money and pay off the rest of the farm, the money that the boys had earned." So one night, Herb and Ray, they packed their suitcases and they literally snuck out a bedroom window and hopped a train back to Chicago without telling their parents. Things continued to get worse on the farm. Elias fell ill and was not able to work anymore. Without the help of the older boys, they decided to sell. So Walt and Roy were tasked with posting all of these signs for the auction to sell off the remaining stocks and farm equipment. The boys watched while all of those animals that they had named and played with and loved were sold to other families, and they had to say goodbye. Eventually, it was all gone, and the Disneys left Marceline for Kansas City. Walt's idyllic childhood was over. Before Taylor Swift invented Kansas City, the Disneys lived there. Thank you all, two of you who laughed at that. With money from the farm sale, Elias purchased a paper route, and Walt and Roy, both young as they were tasked with making a lot of the deliveries. This meant getting up at the crack of dawn and delivering that morning edition, going to school all day, and then going back out for the evening route and doing the whole thing again. Kansas City was prone to blizzards, and sometimes the roads weren't plowed, so Walt had to trudge through feet and feet of snow to make those deliveries. Between school and the paper route, Walt really didn't have time to be a kid. Something that I think is so sad is that he would stop on his route while he was delivering papers and play with toys that other children had left in their front yards. Sad. He was only 9 years old at the time. He had recurring nightmares, even as an adult, that he had failed to make all of those delivery stops. Despite this, Walt learned a lot of valuable lessons, many from his dad, in hard work and top-notch customer service. And those things he would take with him through the rest of his life. And really, they continue to do at Disney, all the Disney parks and in everything they do today. Instead of tossing the papers from the sidewalk and hoping you nailed that front porch, Elias thought about the customer's experience. You know, they're getting up in the morning, they have to go out and get that paper. What would be best? He insisted that the papers be placed under a brick or a rock, in a storm door, under a doormat, anything that would prevent them from being blown all over the place. So thinking about that customer experience early on. Fortunately, Walt did have some time for fun at school. He would later say, "I would do anything to attract attention." You know, people like that. When he was in 5th grade, He made a costume and he came to class with a shawl around him as Abraham Lincoln. He gave the Gettysburg Address in front of the entire class unprovoked, and the teachers were so delighted with this that they carted him around to every classroom to repeat the performance. He also became pals with this boy right here, Walt Pfeiffer, and they nicknamed themselves the Two Bad Walters. And they began performing comedy routines in the area and entering talent contests, and they even won a couple. They did pretty well. Walt actually started considering, maybe I'll be an actor when I grow up. However, he was still drawing constantly. He still had that same love of drawing as Aunt Margaret had prepared for him back in the day. His drawings had attracted the attention of a local barber who offered Walt a haircut in exchange for a drawing to put in his shop. The two continued this agreement for a long time, and Walt's drawings became the talk of the neighborhood. Even Elias was impressed. And in an uncharacteristic move, he agreed to let Walt take art classes on Saturday at the Kansas City Art Institute when he turned 14. Here, Walt began learning those early rudimentary art skills and really finding his style. Drawing became a part of his identity at school and all around the town. Meanwhile, America was engaged in World War I. Ray Disney, the older brother, had already been drafted into the Army, and Roy O. enlisted with the Navy. And Walt was so jealous. He wanted to go off and have this big adventure, but at 16, he was too young. But he found a loophole. He and a school friend learned that the Red Cross Ambulance Corps was hiring drivers, and you only had to be 17 to do that. So he begged his parents, sign my forms, I want to go have an adventure. Flora and Elias, good parents, were not about it, but eventually Flora relented. Only problem, Walt was only 16 and you had to be 17. So he forged his documents. Instead of 1901, he just changed that 1 into a 0. Oh, suddenly I'm 17. Shipped off to France after that. By the time he got over there, though, the armistice had already been signed and the action was pretty much over. I guess everybody in the room was very disappointed to find that out. But there was still a lot of work to do. They did deliveries, he drove dignitaries and other assignments throughout France. And he kept drawing. As you can see here, he drew on the side of his truck. There's a little cartoon guy. He did that for several other friends as well. He made drawings to send home, and he tried sending some to a couple media outlets, but they all got rejected. When he left the US as a 17-year-old, he was a boy, but he returned a man. He gained weight and muscle, he grew taller, and he had all this new confidence. He also picked up smoking, which became a long habit. Before Walt left France, the Disneys had actually moved to Chicago. They were always moving. And Elias had gotten a new job at the Ozell Company, a jelly canning company. So not really very exciting, but paid the bills. Walt returned from France, and he was faced with a choice. He could either slide easily into a job at the canning company, or he could strike out on his own and become an artist. He decided to go with canning company, and that's where the story ends. So. No. Next, what happened is he got a job at a commercial advertising firm in Kansas City in 1919. He could not believe, I'm getting paid to draw, finally. This is all I've ever wanted. Unfortunately, the job was pretty short-lived, and all the young artists were laid off after that busy Christmas advertising season. But Walt came away with something a little bit more valuable, and a friend he had and coworker became a big part of his life and a big part of the Disney story. He had a really unusual name, Ub Iwerks. It's German, allegedly. Ub was a meticulous artist. You can see his picture up there. He drew so fast. He could crank out those drawings like nobody else. He was also really shy, really reserved, and he made a very good foil to the gregarious Walt Disney. A coworker once said of the rather monosyllabic Ub, "Our 2 words would barely suffice. He used one." Ub and Walt decided, let's go into business together. Let's make this drawing stuff happen. And they named their company Iwerks Disney. They couldn't do Disney iWorks because that sounds like an optometry company. So iWorks Disney it was. They did illustrations, letterheads, magazines, and other things, but neither of them really saw this as a long-term investment. So when jobs opened up at the Kansas City Slide Company, both of them eventually got jobs there, and their side hustle went under. Walt was also becoming increasingly obsessed with animation, not just cartoons, but how do they move? How do you make them look realistic? And he borrowed a movie camera and made some drawings and started shooting these little movies in his Uncle Robert's garage. He and Roy were living together at the time, and they kind of started looking at it with something together. And all that experimenting led to the next phase of his creative ambitions, Laugh-O-Gram Studio. Such a great name. Walt records and sells his first animated cartoon short to a local theater, and it's a story about the Kansas City Police Department cleaning up crime. I'm going to show you a clip of this, and it's really the one animated short that we can say was fully animated by Walt Disney. Check out that visor. Why? How cute is that, right? So they had secured a contract to create 12 animated shorts. Go to the next slide here. Yep. 12 animated shorts, and he hired his animator friends, including iWorks, to produce them. The group was basically a bunch of friends and a camera, creating different scenarios, trying out different camera tricks. They were just goofing off and having a great time. But they came out with it with some really great products that they believed in. They were fairy tales with a modern spin on it, and they started to get some good attention from this. They were successful enough to get a 2-room office space in the second floor of this building right here. You can see it back in the 1920s. And then the same building down there you can see. And it's the same today from the exterior, but they have this really cool mural saying Walt Disney Cartoonist, which I think is fun. That's the building they were in. Laugh-O-Grams actually ended up bankrupt, but it wasn't really their fault. It was the distributor's fault. Distributors basically take the product and distribute it, send it out to all of the different outlets in order to be played in theaters. So the distributor, instead of paying the studio, they promised this $11,100 paycheck. It's coming your way. And they received $100 out of that. So they went under. Instead of being discouraged, though, Walt decides to blow a bunch of money on a whole new project. Very classic Walt Disney. He names this project Alice's Wonderland. What's important to know here is that conventional animation at the time basically would take these animated cartoon characters and put them into a real-life backdrop. So you have a clown that's jumping on the Empire State Building and things like that. Walt said, well, that's good, but we could do better. He reversed that idea and put a real person into an animated world and have them act through things around that. So you see there's a little girl here, that's Alice. Virginia Davis was the girl who acted as Alice, and there were a couple others that came after her. And so she would react to things and see these animals and stuff, and there's nothing around her. She's a pretty good little actress. We'll see the same theme of taking animation and putting it into a real-life scenario later on in movies like Song of the South and Mary Poppins. Now that this crew had made this great film, Alice's Wonderland, it's going to be big. They needed a way to get it out there in the world, to find that distributor. Alrighty, that's different. So Walt goes around, he shops Alice's Wonderland, but unfortunately nobody took the bait. He'd unfortunately used all of his money to make this film, and so the company goes bankrupt. This is rock bottom moment number one for Walt. He didn't have any family to move in with, and he couldn't pay rent anywhere since he'd blown all his money on this movie. And so he moved into the Laugh-O-Gram studios and slept under his desk. He took showers at the train station. He ate cold beans out of a can and relied on the generosity of a Greek restaurant nearby whose owners would give him food without asking for any pay. Clearly, he needed a change, and he decided that it was time to go to Hollywood. Some of his family had already moved west, including his parents, Elias and Flora, who had reconciled with the older son, Herb, and his family, and they all moved out to Portland, Oregon. Walt packed up a cardboard suitcase with 2 spare shirts in it, gathered what little money he had left, and in classic Walt Disney fashion, buys himself a first-class ticket out to Los Angeles. Roy was already out in California recovering from tuberculosis. Back in those days, if someone had tuberculosis, they'd say, just go out in the sun for a little while. It'll be okay. The sun will cure you. It actually did, and he got better. Fortunately, he was able to make a living selling vacuum cleaners door to door, and Walt joins him, but then he gets a telegram from New York City. The telegram was from Margaret Winkler. See a picture of her up there. She was a film producer and distributor out of New York, and she was kind of a pioneer for women in the film industry. They didn't have positions like this, but she did. She had received the Alice's Wonderland reel, and she wanted to sign Walt and Laugh-O-Gram Studios to produce more films. One problem with that, that company no longer existed. Oh, shoot. So Walt hurriedly puts together another company with his brother Roy to accept the offer, assembles a little team, and Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio was born. They somehow convinced Virginia Davis, the star of the Alice films, and her whole family to move out to California. And he also convinced iWorks to come out, as well as some of his animator friends from Kansas City. Now, I think this really points to Walt's charisma and ability to inspire people, because remember, the last time these guys worked for him, they didn't get a paycheck and the company went bankrupt. Somehow, he convinces them all to come out and join him in this pursuit together. Then the Alice films, they started to gain a little traction. Walt started to really taste a little bit of real success for the first time. They were able to pay their staff, thank goodness, hire more staff, and they were really happy with the stuff that they were putting out. Altogether, there were 57 Alice short films that were created over the course of 5 years. A few different girls played Alice, and all of the films were distributed by Margaret Winkler's company. The Alice films were pretty expensive to produce, so in order to cut down on some of that production cost, they also created a new character for the animated shorts named Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Any of you heard of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit? Yeah, kind of a niche character, a few of you know. Oswald was fun. He was so expressive, and he was immensely popular right off the bat. During this successful time, his older brother Roy married his longtime sweetheart Edna Francis in 1923. Roy and Walt had been sharing an apartment in California, and they were really over that situation. So what do? Get married. Walt began dating one of the girls in the Disney Studios office, Lillian Bounds. She worked in ink and paint. And now what this means is that her job was to take colored paint and put it on these plastic cells and prepare them to get ready for the camera. This is something that is still essentially done today in some respects, just a little bit different equipment. The two of them got married in 1925, and as with everything with Walt Disney in these early days, it was so great until it wasn't. In 1924, Margaret Winkler married a man named Charles Nitz. Even though Margaret was really this pioneer gal in the film industry and really a tycoon of this industry, very impressive lady, it was still the 1920s, so when she got married, she gave the business to her husband, essentially. Charles wasn't quite as impressed with this Walt Disney as Margaret had been, and the two men bickered over everything. The mood at the Disney Brothers studio was also beginning to sour because even though they were really successful, Walt had this meticulous insistence on perfection. There were long hours and the wages were starting to take a toll. They weren't super high, even though they were having a lot of success. Author Stephen Watt said in PBS's American Experience series on Walt, I think the two sides of Disney emerged. On one hand, you have Walt the inspirer. On the other hand was Disney the driver, who demanded work, demanded creativity, demanded productivity. And if people didn't meet those standards, he could come down on you like a ton of bricks. One day, Ub Iwerks comes to Walt and informs him, hey, I got a job offer from Charles Mintz. But that wasn't the worst of it. Ub informed him that Mintz had hired away all of the other animators from the studio. They were all going to make those Oswald films together without Walt Disney. Even though the studio was producing all of these films, the person who owned the rights to the character of Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit, and Alice was Charles Mintz. Walt's team had abandoned him, and Walt had such tunnel vision on the product, thinking how to make this story the best it could be, he didn't even realize that people around him were unhappy. Rock bottom moment number 2. Walt went to New York to try to meet with Mintz and work this out, but to no avail. On the long cross-country train ride back, he knew he had to start over with a literal blank piece of paper. He'd have to come up with a new character, and he picked a mouse. There were a couple loyalists who had not left for Charles Mintz's new factory. And so they all went back to the drawing table and created their new hero that was going to save the studio, Mickey Mouse. Fun fact, originally Walt came up with the name Mortimer, and Lily was like, nah, that's not it. How about Mickey? There we go. That has the right ring to it. Ub Iwerks was the one who drew Mickey. Walt actually provided his voice for the first couple of films, and you can find those on YouTube if you look carefully. To set these movies apart from other animations at the time, Walt said, we need sound. That's going to make us different, set us apart. And the sound has to match what people are seeing on screen. Back then, it was just music in the background, and then you'd see a title card with the dialogue on it. He didn't want that. He wanted the characters to talk and have those pieces of dialogue match up with what you're seeing. This is something that I think is so great. When they were filming all of this, they had the guy with the wood block, the guy with the slide whistle, the guy with the voice. They all had to line up with the big animation on the screen and basically time it exactly to that animation running across. So you got to hit your cue right on time. And like, can you imagine being the person with the wood block who misses your cue and then you have to start all over again? It was really, really tedious, but it worked out. After 2 other quick test films, Steamboat Willie was released to the public on November 18th, 1928, and audiences were enthralled. They've never seen something like this before. When the smokestack is puffing, there's a puff sound. When the character is talking, there's dialogue. It's just so unique and new. And Mickey Mouse became Hollywood's newest celebrity, literally. He was scrappy, he was optimistic, he was funny, he danced, he sang, he was everything. Mickey encourages Americans through the Great Depression. And this is when the first Mickey Mouse Club started popping up in local theaters. Was anyone here a part of a Mickey Mouse Club at any point? No? Just me. Cool. More than 1 million children signed up. 1 million children. Mickey also provides another very important source of revenue for the studio, licensing. Everything with Mickey on it, plushes, hats, shirts, watches, balloons, the thing that George and Lorraine are wearing right now. All of that comes from that idea of licensing. And there's a man who does not get nearly enough credit for all of that fun Disney stuff that we wear today, and that's Kay Kamen. There's a picture of him up here. He was an ad guy, and he brought his advertising genius to the Disney studios and started creating all of these partnerships. And all of these things were spilling out into the marketplace. Kids would bring their Mickey Mouse lunchbox to school, and then all the other kids had to have one. Kamen also kept a very fastidious hold on the rights. So, looking at you, Charles Mintz, he wanted to know how Mickey was going to be portrayed, and they carefully crafted that image to be exactly what they wanted. Fortunately, everybody wanted the mouse, and partnerships were plentiful. So Disney sails through the Great Depression relatively unscathed because of Mickey, and also because of a new series called the Silly Symphonies. One of these, now that we're coming up on Halloween, is the skeleton dance. Some of you may recognize that. There's a bunch of skeletons dancing around a graveyard. And these became very, very popular. They also became high art. So before, cartoons were pretty crass and just kind of everything was a gag. And these kind of started to create some stories, and the art was really, really good. In 1926, the company had outgrown their space, and they moved to a building on Hyperion Avenue. And it was at this time that they renamed it the Walt Disney Studios. They expanded to over 200 employees and counting, and they were innovating every single day and setting those bars higher and higher for animation. Walt also arranged for art classes. He sent everybody back to school and wanted them to get better at their craft, not just this rudimentary stuff. We're creating art here. Walt's personal life was also looking up too. After he and Lillian got married, they desperately wanted a child, but unfortunately, Lillian had several devastating miscarriages. But in 1933, she gave birth to their daughter, Diane. A couple years later, they adopted another daughter named Sharon, and Walt was overjoyed. He was so excited to be a dad and create the most loving, fun childhood possible for his parents. Diane would often say he drove us to school every day of our lives. He was at the studio for long hours, but he wanted to be the one to drop us off. After I got my driver's license, he drove Sharon. He was a very hands-on parent. He was also probably, although he probably wouldn't say it, healing a little bit of his own childhood as well through his daughters. Walt was always looking ahead. He could have been content doing these short films forever and creating sequels. Side note, Toy Story 5 comes out next year. But he wasn't happy with that. He always wanted to be doing something new. So one evening in 1934, he gathers all of the employees into the studio for an important meeting, but he won't tell them what it's about. So they will tell the story for decades. They're all in there, they're waiting, they want to know what it's about, they're all excited, and then Walt takes the stage. This is the guy, remember, who had convinced animators to move across the country after their company went bankrupt. He continues that in full form. Walt the Inspirer was out to play. He's in the spotlight and he proceeds to act out a story. He voices all the characters, he impersonates all the animals, and he takes the audience through this roller coaster of emotions. By the time he is finished, that audience is spellbound. He proposes something that's never been done, never even been tried before. A full-length, story-driven cartoon. Does anyone want to guess what film it was? Was anyone alive in 1939? Fantasia's a good guess. I heard Snow White from somebody. That's right, it was Snow White. Fantasia will come soon, though. It's really important to remember there is no roadmap for this project. The Hyperion Studio employees couldn't base Snow White off of anything, any existing projects, because no one had ever done this before. Walt continued to put an emphasis on making those drawings better. You can see here in these pictures, he hired a dancer and other actors to come in and perform movements for the animators so they could see how people laughed, how people sat down, how they skipped, how they danced, how they looked angry. He also placed mirrors at all of the animators' desks. You can see this great picture of Irv Spence there. He's making a face and drawing it. And the process was really grueling. They were learning a lot, but it was really hard work. And they quickly blew through most of their budget and all of their deadlines. Stories of these delays and the stress that it was causing got to the press. Stories started to come out, and they started to call it Disney's folly. The employees were really tired, they were overworked, but at the same time, they believed in this project so much that they were willing to put in all those extra hours. They couldn't wait to have this be put out into the world. And Walt knew that he was taking a gamble, right? Prior to Snow White, like I said, cartoons served one purpose. They made people laugh, and then you're on to the feature. But he wanted the story to pull them in so much that they forgot that they were watching a cartoon. He wanted to make them cry. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs opened on December 21st, 1937 at the Carthay Circle Theater in California. Clark Gable, Judy Garland, Marlene Dietrich, and other Hollywood A-listers got all dressed up and walked the red carpet for a cartoon. According to the PBS American Experience series on Walt Disney, the audience gasped at the opening shots of the Queen's castle. They howled in laughter at the antics of the dwarves. They hissed disapproval with the evil queen. And when Snow White was lying there, appearing to be dead, her dwarf friends surrounding her with tears streaming down their faces, the audience started to cry. They had suspended their belief so thoroughly and so believed in the reality of the situation that they were crying. And in the vein of people crying over Disney movies, I'd like to introduce my first sidebar. One of the things that comes up often with Disney things is that Disney is just for kids. It just makes everything light and happy and fluffy, and there's no seriousness or gravitas about it at all. Walt actually dealt with this way back to Snow White, why he wanted to make him cry, and so that's why we are talking about this now. Until they actually saw Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, no one believed that a cartoon could truly capture people, but it did. So let's take a moment and visit some common misnomers of Disney movies and then reframe them to think about a different message. By the way, this is all my opinion. Let's take Cinderella. You could say that it's about waiting for a prince to save you, or you could think about it as inspiration for not letting others break your spirit, and kindness always wins the day. Sleeping Beauty. You could say that this is about true love's kiss will make your life complete, or there are consequences for throwing away your family for a guy you just met. 101 Dalmatians is about how animals are better than people, which is true. Lady and the Tramp is about class differences and single-handedly making spaghetti into the most romantic food. Pocahontas, you could really focus on those historical inaccuracies, which are true, or you could think about how being so entrenched in your differences leads to violence and a loss of community, and what that takes away from you. It's also about how raccoons make really good pets. Mary Poppins, for heaven's sake, is about work-life balance. My friend Emily wanted me to also mention that when you're growing up and watching The Little Mermaid, you think Ariel is right about everything. And when you're an adult, you realize King Triton was really right about everything. Anyway, come on screen. Anyway, back to Snow White. It's impossible to overstate the success of this film. First, it hit the United States. It was a huge hit here, and then it went international. It broke box office records, and theaters kept having to renew it over and over again for more runs to meet that demand. Roy was really happy because he could pay off the company's remaining debts from the first run alone. And so the first thing, as they often did, was outgrow their space for the studio. While working on Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi, the company was solvent enough to create their own state-of-the-art studio. In classic Walt Disney fashion, he purchased this sweeping 51-acre lot in Burbank while Roy was out of town in Europe. It's actually the same studio space that they use today, although it's changed a little bit over the years. Walt basically builds his Barbie dream house here, rather Barbie dream campus, because there were all these different buildings, all air conditioned, and it had this whole community campus-like feel to it. Every animator had a breezy, well-lit workspace with a large desk, an area rug, and drapes. The shutters on the building are a little hard to see, but if you look closely, you'll notice them. They were specially designed to be raised and lowered to change the lighting based on what the animator needed at the time. There was a cafeteria that would bring lunch to your desk if you needed it. Walt got a lot of milkshakes. A theater, a gym with a personal trainer on duty, a gas station with a mechanic on duty, and even outdoor ping pong tables. How fun is that? There were also separate spaces and buildings for animating, ink and paint, camera, orchestra, etc. Walt even wanted to build apartments on the lot so that no one had to leave. They didn't do that. There's also something that important happens in 1941, so the same time this is going on. Anyone want to guess 1941? World War II. You're so smart. Yep, World War II. The troops actually took over some of these big new studio buildings, and they wanted to keep an eye on this big nearby aircraft plant. So next to the animators, you might have a military guy. Kind of an interesting dynamic. The war was a huge blow to the studio because the entire European market is cut out. The Disney brothers, they both begin to sweat because they just spent all this money creating this beautiful studio. And the features just were not earning back that amount of money that they were spending prior to the war because of the European market being cut off. And people also were not necessarily going out to films quite as much either. But they did a few things to earn the money back. They took the company public for the very first time and sold shares. And they were contracted to produce training films, propaganda films, print materials, all kinds of things for the military. Donald Duck starred in a lot of these, and Dumbo was a surprise hit during this time as well. Simple little story, big, big impact. And just take a second to look at these. So creative, they're so fun. If you have to be drafted, at least you can be taught by Pluto. Despite all of the success, the growing pains at the studio were becoming apparent. You could almost kind of say that they got too big too fast. The new studio was so beautiful and so state-of-the-art and really idyllic, but it also brought to the surface some important underlying issues. The departments, remember, they were all split up into different buildings, and it felt more like a factory than that collaborative, fun, yell across the room to your buddy studio in Hyperion. And the pay gaps also started to be really noticeable. The top animators were earning a lot of money, and the ink and paint folks were not earning very much at all. Salaries were all over the place, nothing was organized, and that gap started to really be a problem. This led to a strike at Disney in 1941. Lots of things happening. You know, you have to hand it to Disney animators and animators in general. They know how to make a good sign. I mean, that one has multiple pieces. Come on. So we could really do a complete talk that is just about this strike. It is really complicated, but I'm going to limit the scope of that quite a bit for our purposes here. There is a book on the table, kind of on that end, that is called The Disney Revolt, The Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age by Jake S. Friedman. It's really the most balanced strike book, or a balanced take on this strike. The PBS American Experience documentary misses a few things. There's other documentaries that kind of miss a few things, in my opinion, and this really dives into those nitty-gritty details. So highly, highly recommend this book. So back to the story. Walt was the kind of person, as we've seen with Charles Mintz, that he becomes so focused on a project and the outcome that he doesn't really see what's going on around him. At the same time, his job was on the creative side. He's the story guy, not really the book guy, not the day-to-day writing those checks guy. And those who were in charge of that part of the company, in my opinion, kind of dropped the ball here. The company was also very ill-advised by their lawyer, Gunther Lessing, and so much so that he actually became an enemy to both the company heads and the strikers by the end. Everybody just hated him at the end. That's who they started out getting advice from. The talks began relatively friendly, though. The workers wanted a union. The upper management folks said, no problem, have at it. But then the workers couldn't quite figure out which animation union that they wanted. The company essentially organized a union for them to join, but that wasn't really a good solution either. Meanwhile, throughout the rest of the country, there's all these different union organizers, and they are closing in on all of the studios and reorganizing them. It's important to know, too, that the union organizers at the time were profiting greatly off of their earnings from doing this, and they saw Disney Studios as their white whale. So the Disney workers, they go on strike, and the strike hits Walt very personally. He really takes this hard. Plus, he didn't really know or see that it was going to happen. He believed, we're all in this together, we're making these great films. And he was angry and confused that these people that he thought he trusted were now, in his mind, turning their backs on him. He thought they were ungrateful, and he could not understand how they could do this to him, how they could do this to this company that he had poured his entire life into. Roy knew that Walt's anger, which is oddly similar to Elias's, was not helping in this situation, so he sent him out of the country while the negotiations were happening. There was an offer for Walt to go on a goodwill tour of South America by the US government and create a couple films there to kind of get things going. So Walt and Lillian, they grab a camera and they jet off to South America, and the strike is settled while they're there. The workers were pretty pleased with the outcome. All the demands had pretty much been met, but that bitterness, that still remained, and it stayed. The workers felt like they had been treated unfairly and weren't listened to, and Walt felt like he had been betrayed. Some people have said there's Walt Disney before the strike and there's Walt Disney after the strike, and they are two different people. Now, there's another question that pops up a lot when it comes to Disney stuff, and this is as good of a time as any to get it out in the open. Was Walt Disney anti-Semitic or racist? Some of you have probably heard this rumor. Walt was more conservative in some ways, in most ways, to be honest, but he was pretty liberal in others. He voted for a lot of Democrats in the 40s, and he hired people that probably wouldn't have gotten hired at other studios. But overall, he was not someone who was politically minded. He'd be that guy today who would be like, oh, I don't do politics. Some people have called him politically naive. He just didn't pay much attention. It didn't interest him. And you could also say he wasn't big on unions because he had watched his father join a union for the farmers of America. I don't remember the exact name, but he saw his father get taken advantage of, and he didn't forget that. Another thing with unions and Walt is that he had worked in this building. It was called the Federal Building in Chicago when he was a teenager. And there was Eugene Debs. He was a socialist and really big character in history at the time. And he was put in jail, and a union organizer threw a bomb into the building. Walt missed it by 3 minutes. So he didn't have the best idea about unions, but he also wasn't really against it either. But again, he just didn't want to deal with it. This is in great contrast to the most prominent leader of the strike, Art Babbitt. Art was a top animator. He was a brilliant artist at the studio, and he actually brought us the character of Goofy. So think of Art Babbitt next time you see Goofy on something, among other characters as well. Art, on the other hand, he had grown up fighting for social justice, for unions, right alongside his parents. His mother, Zelda, she was a Spitfire. She went out there to fight. He was a complicated character because I think he really did sympathize with those lower level workers, but he also wasn't one to shy away from the attention that came from organizing. The personality differences between Walt and Art Babbitt are stark, but at the same time, they're really similar. They were both stubborn, very one-track minded, firmly entrenched in their way of doing things. Bottom line, Art Babbitt was not impressed by Walt Disney's folksiness and all shucks, and Walt Disney was annoyed by Babbitt's bravado. They butted heads constantly, and it's important to note that Art Babbitt was Jewish. This is a quote that I feel sums this situation up very, very well. And it's from that book I mentioned, The Disney Revolt by Jake Friedman. Bitterness from the strike bred bitterness. Veterans of the Disney strike called Walt an anti-Semite. This made Babbitt's martyrdom more personal and gave them justification to antagonize Walt Disney. It became a battle cry of the ex-strikers who wanted to punish Walt the way they felt they had been punished. However, the accusation had only emerged in the fury and aftermath of the labor dispute. It is, at no time beforehand is it remotely alluded to. Actually, Walt had a number of Jewish and half-Jewish people in his close orbit, including Gunther Lessing, Joe Rosenberg, Joe Grant, and Mark Davis, among many. The fact that Babbitt and some strikers were Jewish is more of a statement about the propensity of Jewish activism in the 20th century. Another question on the second part of this is, was Walt Disney racist? One example that a lot of people point to is the movie Song of the South. This was a very controversial film that was released in 1946, and it shows slaves happily singing folk songs, and overall, it's just kind of tone deaf. Walt should have known that this wasn't a good look, but he just didn't. He thought the folktales themselves were so important, and he focused all of his energy into portraying those. And again, so focused on that outcome that he didn't realize the context around and how that could be perceived. If you think this all sounds like excuses, here are 3 quotes from people who worked for the company and knew Walt personally. It was pure nonsense. I think that whole idea should be put to rest and buried deep because there's no validity there. Joe Grant, animator. It's slander. If a person was a nice person, he loved you. Richard Sherman, songwriter. Over the years, a number of people have asked me that same question about Walt being anti-Semitic or black, anti-black. I would respectfully have to disagree. That was not the man I knew. Spike Lee, who I respect a great deal as a filmmaker, made a comment once about Walt being a racist. I'd have to say, Spike, you never met Walt. I did. You can decide for yourself what you think about this issue. I wanted to present some information from some insight from folks who knew him well, but you can decide for yourself. So the war created this big dent in the studio's finances, but Walt, again, always looking ahead to the next thing. But this time it was not really in the way that people expected. There are 2 things that start this next chapter of Walt's life. And the first is with Ward Kimball and his backyard train. For those of you who are looking for a Minnesota connection, here it is. So Ward Kimball, this guy up here, he was one of the 9 old men, which is a group of 9 longtime animators at the studio, and he was born in Minneapolis. Yay! He was born at what is now known as Abbott Northwestern Hospital, and according to his birth record, he lived over by Lake Harriet. His sister was born a few years later, and the family moved to Kansas when he was 6, but it still counts. The reason I know all this is because I bought his birth certificate. So if you don't believe me, you can come up and check this out at the end. Who does that? Only me. So Ward Kimball, he was a super funky guy. He was lots of fun. He was always wearing these loud pattern shirts and these round rim glasses, his hair all askew. He played the jazz trombone. And another quick side note, has anyone here ever heard that Walt Disney is frozen? Yeah, I know some of you have. He is not. He was cremated and buried at Forest Lawn in California. But Ward Kimball thought that idea was very funny. party. And so he told everybody that that's what happened, and it still persists today. Thanks, Ward. So back to the main task at hand here. Ward and his wife were actually the first private citizens in the US to own their own steam locomotive. So he invites Walt over to this party that he and his wife were hosting. And Walt is just giddy over this train. He can't believe that they have their own steam locomotive, and he wants one too. So Lillian was not about to let him rip up all of her landscaping. So Walt, along with others from the studio, built an extensive set of train tracks carefully around her gardens, using a couple tunnels where necessary, and he built his own smaller scale model train that you could ride on. Now, look at this picture here. Those are not all children riding on this train. He had the best time inviting people over, and he named it the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad after the name of their street. He also had a barn built on the property that looked a lot like the barn back in Marceline. So this thing, along with, inspired by Ward Kimball's locomotive, is one piece of the puzzle that introduces that next chapter. The second piece of the puzzle is a thought that Walt has while taking his daughters, Diane and Sharon, out to play. They liked Griffith Park in California, so the girls could ride the carousel and run around. And you'll see the picture of the carousel right up there too. Walt would say, as I'd sit there while they rode the merry-go-round, I'm on a bench eating peanuts, I felt that there should be something that parents and children could have fun together doing. You can probably see where this is going, right? We have finally made it to Disneyland. At the time, just to provide some context here, amusement parks were not the places that they are today. They were seedy, they were dirty, they were unsafe. You didn't want to send your kids to a carnival or an amusement park. But Walt said, mine's not going to be like that. Mine's going to be clean. Mine's going to be safe. Now, how are we going to pay for it? I can feel Roy sweating. The amusement park was a seemingly big and random jump from these great movies that they were making. You know, you're making movies and now you want an amusement park? What's that about? There were a lot of naysayers. So Roy shops around this idea and he finally lands a deal with ABC. Plot twist, they will come to own ABC later on. But at the time, ABC signs up, we want to help you with Disneyland. And in return for that significant investment, Walt reluctantly agrees to do a weekly show called Disneyland. He's the host. He later jokes that because ABC was the third-rated network out of 3, they needed a show so damn bad they bought the amusement park. People knew who Walt Disney was prior to these television appearances, but this really solidifies him as a celebrity. Crews worked around the clock to get this park open on time. They were so behind. The night before it was set to open, into the wee hours of the morning, crews were still installing rides, situating landscaping, and painting murals. Side note on the landscaping, they wanted mature trees, but you can't just grow one of those overnight. And so they actually had people donate trees in their backyard that they were going to tear down anyway. And they put them upside down in the Jungle Cruise so you could see the root structure. Kind of fun. As all of this is happening, Walt Disney is right in the thick of it. He is painting set pieces for the ride based on the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He's there doing it with the gas mask on. Disneyland opens to the public on July 17th, 1955. And the whole thing was done as a live broadcast, which is really a unique thing for that time. And there were some familiar faces like Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings, and even Ronald Reagan, who host, all friends. There's something about this that will just amaze you. So, you know, if you don't see something on TV in those days, you'd miss it. Nobody wanted to miss this. Half of the entire country was sitting in their living rooms glued to the TV watching this broadcast. Half of the country. How crazy is that? The first day was a little bit chaotic. The company had distributed 15,000 invitations, But then counterfeiters created duplicates, and they had 28,000 people show up on opening day. That's why we pass out our house tour booklets at the last minute. It was also crazy hot outside because it's July in California, and the women's high heels actually got stuck in the asphalt. It hadn't totally set yet. There was also a gas leak in the castle, so flames were shooting out of it for a little bit. And there was a plumber strike that was settled right before opening day. So they had to make a choice between bathrooms and drinking fountains. Walt said, people can buy Pepsi Cola, but they can't pee in the street. They chose the bathrooms. Despite all this chaos, it didn't matter. Within 7 weeks, 1 million visitors had come to Disneyland. They met their favorite characters. They gazed up in awe at the castle, and they remembered fond memories of their childhoods while watching their children make beautiful ones on their own. The park was carefully crafted to feel completely immersive in this magical experience. Fun fact, world dignitaries also came and still continue to come to Disneyland. And this is well documented, by the way. Nikita Khrushchev, his visit got canceled due to security reasons, and he threw a fit. He was so mad he didn't get to go to Disneyland. I want to point out a couple fun design features at Disneyland and Disney World. So if you ever go there sometime soon, you can keep these in mind and go look for them. Let's start with the entrance gate. You see that right up there, and then Main Street up here. There's only one entrance into the Disney parks, and it seems normal now, but at the time, and really even with some amusement parks today, there's always multiple entrances so it doesn't get super crowded. Disney has one big one, and the reason for that is because Walt wanted to have this experience and everyone to have the same experience as you're walking in. You're not coming in the side of the park and just getting the back of the building. You are on Main Street, right in the thick of it. Let's see. Oh, yeah, the first thing you see is Main Street, sorry. So the thing about Main Street, and you can see it up here, Walt never forgot Marceline. That was the happiest point in his life, was being in Marceline, in that little town and on that farm. So he wanted to recreate that. So the first thing that he wants is to create that Main Street and have everybody experience it for the same way that he did. Now, there's some hidden things with this Main Street, though. The engineers, or they're known as Imagineers, of course, in Disney World, in Disneyland, they cooked up this idea with Main Street and used the concept of forced perspective. I'll tell you what this means. They made the second and third stories of the buildings shorter than the first. And you can see that with this guy here. See how short that second story is? This makes the buildings look taller than they actually are. And the same thing is that way with the castle, especially at Disney World. You can see a picture of it right here. See how big that first floor is? And then it gets smaller and smaller. Tricky, tricky. The idea behind this is that the castle is the Grande Dame at the end of the street. It's a castle on a hill. It doesn't have to be on a hill. We can just make it look that way. Another design feature is that nearly everywhere you look in Disney, you're able to spy something in the distance. It might be the top of a building, part of the castle, top of a ride, anything like that. And because you can spot it from far away, you're naturally drawn over to go look at it. This encourages movement throughout the park, and it kind of makes you feel like you're getting this little sneak peek, like, oh, I spotted that. Good for me. Walt referred to these little guideposts in the park as weenies, like you're holding up a hot dog for an animal. Come look at the castle. Another thing to notice on Main Street are the windows. This might be my favorite thing. If you look up at those store shop windows, you'll notice these little advertisements. These are fake business names, but they refer to people who are important in Disney history. So Ken Anderson, you'll see his window over here. He's the bait company. He was kind of a jack of all trades at the studio, but he loved fly fishing. So he gets to run the bait company. Ub and his son Don and his granddaughter, Ub's granddaughter, Leslie Iwerks, she is actually a producer and director at Disney now. They have the camera repair and business window, or camera repair business window. You can see their little advertisement there. The Main Street Gazette features Marty Sklar, legendary Disney writer for Disney, and Tony Baxter, who was a tremendous Imagineer. I actually took this next one. It's for Ron Miller, who was Walt Disney's son-in-law. He got married to Diane, and he actually was a pro football player for a while, and eventually he came over and worked for the Disney company. So it made sense to place him at the gym as the night watchman. Next window has a couple up there at the top, that Center Street one, and that includes Herb Ryman. He made the first drawings for Disneyland that Roy took around to potential investors to give them kind of an idea of what they might be getting into. They had this weekend because they had to turn this around really quickly, and Herb spent, I think, like 48 hours straight doing this map. So he obviously has to have a place on the window. Mary Blair, one of my absolute favorites in Disney history. She was a concept artist, and she designed the facade for It's a Small World and all of those little characters inside. And she also has some murals at the Walt Disney Contemporary Resort. One of my favorites, though, is Elias Disney. He gets to be the contractor. Little wink at his dad from far away. So this is a Disney World feature. I know we're talking about kind of both Disneyland and Disney World design-wise, but this is a little history tidbit for you all. Liberty Square is in the part of the park that is honoring colonial to 1800s American history at Disney World. And there's a really small detail here that most people don't see. My dad and I went and took a tour a couple years ago, and we learned this on the tour, and it's just one of my favorite things. So see these shutters here, they're kind of crooked. And at first it's like, wow, that looks really bad. It's Disney going downhill. And the reason for this is because at the time, during this time period, they didn't use metal to have their shutters stay on their houses. They used leather. And over time, that leather starts to stretch. And so your shutters start to grow a little bit askew. And so at Disney, they are permanently cockeyed like that to basically just hone in on the historical accuracy. There's theming for every land. It's throughout everything. You can see these trees in Tomorrowland, and they're cut to look all futuristic. There's engravings in the sidewalk that match the theme of each land. You can see the paw prints and the horse hoof prints in the dirt there and the concrete. The bathrooms are different everywhere. And even at the bottom here, the trash cans are different in every land. It's a completely immersive experience in the littlest of ways, and it makes a big, big difference. It's also just beautiful. Walt didn't want his park to be dirty and dingy. He wanted it to be beautiful. These are all pictures that I took actually at Walt Disney World. And as you can see, it's clean, it's intentionally designed, it's a color study. The landscaping is just immaculate. There is not a single flower petal at Disney that goes unnoticed by the grounds crew and those who make all of this beautifulness happen for us. Back to Disneyland. Walt had a little apartment created for him and his family on the second floor of the firehouse in Disneyland. So if you go to Disneyland, look up in the second story, you'll see a window there, and oftentimes they'll have a light on in there. They're keeping it on for Walt, which I think is very sweet. The apartment was designed to be a hangout for his family. So when they are visiting the park, they can go relax for a little bit. They can stay overnight sometimes. And it was helpful for Walt because after a long day, he could just stay overnight in his own little apartment. Remember back with the Burbank studio, how he wanted no one to be able to leave? Same idea here, but it was just for him. Now, I want to show you guys probably my most prized possession. For Christmas last year, I looked at my wonderful husband, Taylor, and said, I really want you to get me this piece of old carpet. Not usually what people ask for Christmas, but I found a website that sells a tiny piece of this cranberry carpet from the original apartment at Disneyland. Probably smells like cigarette smoke, but I have it here, so you all can look at it. Walt was known to rise early and walk through the park. He would wake up in the firehouse, walk down the stairs, and just walk around. check it all out. Sometimes he would even stroll in his bathrobe before the guest arrived. He would go to one of the little stands and get a glass of orange juice to start his day. He'd drive around in the fire truck. He'd engineer the train. He'd ride on the Jungle Cruise, all while getting input from cast members and guests and making his own notes about how to make this experience even better from the boots on the ground. And that improving process was called plussing. That's how he referred to it. He wanted it to be ever-changing and just as good as it could possibly be. He just loved it. He just loved it. In Bob Thomas's biography about Walt Disney, which is a really wonderful biography, he never seemed, there's a quote that says, he never seemed to tire of striding through the park and watching people and their reactions to Disneyland. Look at them, he enthused to a companion. Did you ever see so many happy people? So many people just enjoying themselves? He was just a kid from a farm in Missouri who grew up too fast and was trying to create beautiful memories for himself and for others. He built Disneyland for many reasons, and one of those was that he simply wanted one. He had a dream, and he went after it with such tenacity and boundless enthusiasm. Disneyland was his ultimate achievement. He had finally created a place that he and all of us could escape to. Tom Hanks's daughter, E.A. Hanks, said, "When things are good, we can take something like that for granted. But when living gets hard, we all want a place that reminds us of the joy and optimism we felt about ourselves and about our lives and about this place." Whether it be Disney movies, parks, or anything else, Walt created a place where good people always come out on top, justice is always served, hard work makes anything possible, and a little bit of magic goes a long way. It's a place where everyone, regardless of any age, can be happy and free away from the stresses and cares of life, at least for a little while. And that concludes our talk, but I do have a couple fun things to show you if you want. So, one of my most prized possessions, and this is actually at my parents' house, and I have a copy of it hanging in my office. My grandfather, Charles Scott Hyatt, when he was a little boy, he saw a little Mickey short, and he thought it was so wonderful, but he was really concerned. Mickey was supposed to go to jail, and he thought, oh no, I have to help him. So my little grandfather puts a couple coins in an envelope and sends it to Walt Disney to help with Mickey's bail. And he received a letter back from Walt Disney himself. This is prior to Snow White, so he had time to do stuff like this. And it says, "Dear Charles, thank you very, very much for your thoughtfulness of Mickey in sending him a contribution to enable him to pay that frightful bill so he won't have to go to jail. We're just sure Mickey won't have to go to such a place as jail, so we're returning your money." I'm sure Roy was not happy about that, but Mickey wants you to know he's very grateful for all of your kindness to him. And as a token of his appreciation, he has requested that we send you one of his newest pictures, which will be mailed to you in another envelope. Mickey, Minnie, Pluto, Donald Duck, and all the rest of our happy barnyard family join me in sending you all good wishes. Sincerely, Walt Disney. So you can come up and look at that, and then this is the picture, and it has my grandfather's name on it. Pretty cool. Hanging in my office now. So if you'd like to come up, I had way more stuff than I thought. I started looking at the bookshelf. I was like, oh boy, there's a lot of things here. So feel free to come up. If you want any recommended reading, recommended documentaries, I'm happy to provide, and there's lots of things to look at. So thank you all so much. This is my most favorite thing in the world. So thanks for letting me talk about it.